This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.
Oh hi, I didn't see you there because I was too busy. My name is Willem and I really like Game Boys. There's something magical about these bricks with laser-powered hardware that still manage to create such fun experiences using short games. And if you talk to anyone who used a DMG or a GBC or a GBA, they'll tell you stories about the game they took everywhere with them and played almost all of the time. Though those conversations tend to be followed up with someone saying, yeah, but those games look terrible now. And while that might be the case back then, right now the Game Boy has never been better. Whether it's modern advancements, or nostalgia, or accessibility using emulation devices, or even people like me, guilty, taking their Game Boys apart and installing new parts and colored screens. The Game Boy has never been better. But what if I told you that that arms race might finally be over? Because later this year, something is coming that will probably upend the entire Game Boy retro revival market. And it is called the Chromatic. It's wild how big of a renaissance the Game Boy has had over the last 2 years. First at the tail end of 2022, though for most customers in 2023, the Analog Pocket released. A device using an FPGA core capable of running Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance games at their native speeds with original cartridges. The device instantly became known as the modern update to the Game Boy. In February 2023, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance games were added to Nintendo Switch Online and made these titles playable on a home console for the very first time. Let alone improvements and parts that have been created for those modding their original systems. The Game Boy is back and more popular than ever. Now, ModRetro is throwing their hat into the ring with the Chromatic. While it has been marketed as the best way to experience Game Boy games to the general public, make no mistake. After getting my hands on it at Gamescom and talking with the creators for a few weeks, I dare to say that this device might be the Game Boy to end all Game Boys. So what is the Chromatic? It is a device about the size and shape of the Game Boy Color. On the front you will find all the buttons you know in the positions they are supposed to be in. Unlike the Game Boy Color, the power button is moved to the position of the original Game Boy at the top of the device. Of course you'll find a headphone jack, but also a USB-C port at the bottom of the handheld. All things considered, it pretty much looks like any ordinary Game Boy. But the difference when holding the device is immediately unmistakable. You may think this is how your Game Boy Color felt, but it could not be further from the truth. The Chromatic has a magnesium alloy shell, making it almost metal in its feel. This means it is not only incredibly durable, but also feels surprisingly light.
The magnesium shell in itself, I think, is probably, other than the screen, is probably one of my favorite things, just because of the fact that it's lightweight, but it's very tough and it has a lot of durability. So for example, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but I would like to say, just kind of in a test case, we're like, our CEO Torrin said, you could run it over with a car. And I'm like, wow, let's run it over with a car. When we actually did our preliminary test, other than some minor scratches, it was solid. Everything inside was the same. You can play the Chromatic the way it's supposed to be played without any issues at all.
Unlike the Analog Pocket, there's a trick up its sleeve, as the Chromatic Retro uses 3 AA batteries. Now before you click away, on paper this might seem like an obstacle, but I think in practice it is actually a good thing. Not only does it make the device more future-proof than lithium-ion rechargeable batteries, which are prone to wear, tear and losing their charge over time, but 3 AA batteries add a significant amount of weight to the device. Not that it becomes too heavy to hold, but rather giving it that near-perfect handheld weight, where it slides comfortably into your hand and you can hold it for hours. The batteries even help to make the buttons feel more responsive, as they add a little bit of resistance to the device when pushing them in. It's touches like these that, as comfortable as the Analog Pocket can be, the Chromatic seems to solve by going back to the physical properties of the Game Boy. So I spoke extensively with lead engineer and designer Torrin from ModRetro about this choice. Quote, "We know that this will deter customers even though this architecture was significantly more complex than a simple baked-in lithium pack. It will take through USB-C power when no batteries are in. Since the early innings of the design, we elected to take a stand to support a truly universal battery by default. Baked-in lithium-ion packs lack flexibility, hot swapping, and have a limited lifespan and often no path to purchasing a replacement. If the company producing them goes out of business, typically the pack is gone with it. Chromatic needed to have a power architecture with ultimate flexibility to live up to our promise to be an heirloom device. You pick up a DMG 30 years later and put in new batteries and you can go play. But at the heart of the device is something even more stunning, the screen. This screen is probably the closest thing to translating the Game Boy to a modern display as one can possibly get. It is, from the ground up, designed to be a 160 by 144 IPS LCD screen solely dedicated to displaying these Game Boy Color games.
The actual screen itself took about maybe 8 to 9 months. It took a lot of time to actually recreate the entire screen to make it exactly a one-to-one of that of the Game Boy Color.
And now we're talking about pixel sizes on the screen and the individual LEDs, right?
Yes. Yes. And we wanted to ensure that everything that was created on here was to replicate the same kind of feeling, that nostalgia that you had when you were actually playing the Game Boy and Game Boy Color back in the day. And so it was very important for us to get that pixel perfect accuracy so that we can actually allow people to play the games the way the artist intended it to play the games.
See, while the Analog Pocket has the right dimensions for the screen itself, the colors and accuracy on that device can be a bit hit or miss. The Chromatic simply does not miss. From every possible viewing angle, the pixels are rendered individually. It was astounding to see Kirby's Tilt and Tumble in action on the device. That while moving it around, it still looked flawless. I have been actively modding my Game Boy handhelds for a little over 2 years now, and the gold standard has always been the IPS screen, or in-plane switching screen, that provides a great sense of color and backlight to the original Game Boy devices. I've also assembled ITA screens that use the bottom screen of a Nintendo DSi for a 1-to-1 screen ratio of the Game Boy Advance. For a recent Game Boy Color project I did, I used an AMOLED screen that was originally designed for BlackBerry phones. While I love my AMOLED display, as it turns off black pixels instead of changing them to the color black, the saturation on most of these displays can feel a bit off. Before I left for Gamescom, I did comparisons between Pokemon Crystal on an original GBA, GBC, my IPS GBA, my ITA GBA SP, and my AMOLED GBC. All of these versions look fine enough if you don't compare them to the original, but when putting it next to the original Game Boy Color screen, I found that all my modded screens misplaced certain colors. The Suicune running on the title screen wasn't a light blue like the original screen, but a deep blue or even purple at times. Of course, all these ITA, IPS, and my AMOLED screens have been repurposed from other devices that weren't all meant to be showing Game Boy games. The screen in the Chromatic is from top to bottom designed for the singular purpose, and it never ceased to amaze me. As I was told by Torin again, developing an LCD involves first defining the thin film transistor glass, which was extremely challenging due to the pixel pitch being so massively large in the modern day. Chromatic goes further with a physical color filter as well to constrain the color gamut to the beautiful subdued palette of the Game Boy. I was left out of the room many times trying to create this display, and I'm very thankful that I ultimately found a TFT factory that was willing to work with us on this very long lead time development. If the Chromatic amounted to nothing, we are happy that the display itself exists to pass down to future generations. So the device itself, even in this prototyping stage, is already mighty impressive. Anyone who's familiar with Game Boy hardware should be able to tell the difference instantly between the Chromatic and other FPGA devices. But ModRetro is going one step further even than that, and is actively releasing new Game Boy games in 2024. Not only is the Chromatic packed in with an improved version of Tetris, an entire library of new games is being developed. The lineup is incredibly varied, from puzzle games like Patchy Matchy to Tokitori, and full-on RPGs like Dragon Hymn and Tales from Monsterland DX.
We think there's a lot of IPs that the current generation should know about. There's a lot of amazing Game Boy and Game Boy Color games that even people that were playing these games at the time don't know about. So we want to reintroduce them in physical form so people can have a collection of games that include original IPs, enhanced versions, colorizations, and we're also supporting the indie community and releasing indie titles as well.
Also, some of these games, if you actually go on those secondary markets, they're extremely expensive.
Toki Tori is legendary for being so rare, right?
Exactly, and so we, to be able to actually play those type of games, you would actually have to spend a ridiculous sum of money to try them out. We're hoping that we'll be able to actually work with a lot of these other companies to bring some of those games to the forefront so that everyone has the opportunity to give it a try.
It's exactly the same as Game Boy Color, Game Boy. They can use GBDK as the engine, or GB Studio, which is the newer engine that has made Game Boy development much more accessible, which is why we're seeing a massive rise in activity in the GB development scene. And in fact, around 1,000 titles have been released, not physically, but both physically and digitally over the last few years, which is nearly in line with the original Game Boy's entire library. So it's crazy, and there's some very, very high quality games coming through now.
The best part of all these cartridges are also compatible with any original Game Boy model, so you don't even have to buy their device to play these games. The team at ModRetro is making sure to curate their selection and give old and new developers access to making their games available in a physical format. The audiophiles will also be pleased, as the Cosporta Pro is available for purchase alongside a Chromatic in the appropriate color. These headsets may look retro for show, but actually COS has never redesigned the Porta Pro since the mid-80s, because the design just works. I was especially excited about this, since the side effect of modding your own Game Boy can be a noticeable hum when listening to audio from the headphone jack of the original. Now, this can be fixed with a separate audio mod, but it is a lot of additional work and cost for modders that use their headphone jack. The team behind the Chromatic took a lot of time and effort into designing the device to make sure it strikes the right balance between retro authenticity and modern sensibility. This is not to say that there is no thought ahead when designing the Chromatic. According to lead engineer Torin, there is a Bluetooth Wi-Fi module on board of the device, but we are choosing not to enable this. Mainly, we felt that Bluetooth audio broke the retro experience that we want out-of-the-box Chromatic to have. Thankfully, since ModRetro was born from the modding scene, they are not excluding future updates and hardware modifications by those ready to take their Chromatic apart. Actually, they designed for it. 4 screws remove the main back shell, which, unlike most handhelds, does not remove the battery itself. This means that the power pack can stay firmly assembled with the back entirely exposed. The PCBA lacks any thin and fragile FPCs, leading to external buttons and speakers, which allows you to disassemble and reassemble quickly without any concern for damaging the product. We designed a fully custom audio module with tiny leaf springs that connect pads on the PCBA so that even the speaker has no connector. These decisions collectively make the device extremely user-friendly to work with, even at the expense of cost or difficulty of the architecture to ModRetro. So my real question was, what's the play here? The Analog Pocket is dedicated to be the all-in-one device, but in an age where we keep buying consumer electronics at a more rapid pace year over year, I feel that there is something to be said about Chromatic choosing to fully commit itself to a singular function. Of course, ModRetro is highly ambitious about this investment and dedication, not just viewing the Chromatic as a gift to consumers, but placing it in the larger picture. The firmware will be open sourced, but Chromatic doesn't natively sideload ROMs due to our core objective to become the legal platform for classic publishers to re-release and remaster their games. We will also be providing CAD files to third parties for buttons, membranes, etc. We envision a large ecosystem of firmware hacks due to the architecture of the system. And I personally feel that this is an ambitious take, but the Chromatic really does seem to be a statement piece alongside its library. Even going so far as to saying, we want to see a renaissance of classic games with colorization, light remastering, etc. to pass down to our children. For example, in our work with Toki Tori, the original developers decided to speed up the character by 2 times, drastically improving the gameplay of an already great game at no expense to the authentic experience. Imagine Colored, Mega Man 5 and other games with quality of life improvements which aren't released by ROM hackers but sanctioned by the original developers and providing them compensation for their work.
With a lot of these retro devices, nostalgia plays a big role. Like, I see Tetris on the Game Boy, and you get the fuzzy feeling. Toki Tori as well. But for those newer games, I can imagine the sell or the marketing for both of you. It's a different challenge, right? You have to convince people to buy a Game Boy, a new Game Boy game in 2024 or 2025. How do you go about that?
The
the community that are following the indie Game Boy scene is growing rapidly. There's a lot of people interested in seeing these new Game Boy games, and being able to market them alongside original IP is a great opportunity in itself, and it is more of a challenge, but people are receptive well to it, and I think people really enjoy the fact that people are still making games for these old consoles, and if we're able to get these games into people's hands and give them a way to play them on a modern device, then it works perfectly. I think our developers appreciate the fact that we're pushing physical, because we're all about physical media, and we're catering to people who appreciate collecting physical media.
I remember I had a layaway stop at Narita Airport in Japan, and I just got the Game Boy, but I only had Tetris and some weird Japanese game called Penguin Wars. And so that was literally the second game that I actually bought, and I had so much fun with it. And then once I found out there's a multiplayer to this, and then you link cable things up, I'm like, this is like the greatest game. And so once I joined ModRetro and I was tasked with going out to purchase a lot of different cartridges, that was the first cartridge I bought. And so, yeah, I mean, it might not be as exciting as anyone else's, choice, but to me, it was just the fact that like I get to play a game that I loved so much when I was a child, and it was just to play it again right now, and more importantly, like recently, I think to test the multiplayer capabilities, I brought out Penguin Wars and I played it with him, and we had so much fun. Right outside, we set up a little Mario Tennis situation, and just to see like, not only young kids playing it, but like older people coming in and just having such a great time.
And introducing their kids to it as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the kids are loving it.
At the moment right now, we're currently taking pre-orders, and I think if you pre-order early on, we're trying our best to ensure that we can get them out to the rest of the people by this holiday season. And I think every signs indicate that I think we're going to be able to do that. And so we hope that people go out and pre-order it right now.
As far as first impressions go, I am really scared that I am turning into a mouthpiece for the Chromatic, but honestly, I really cannot contain my excitement. This feels like the Swiss watch equivalent for Game Boys. Every piece on the in and outside of the device has been treated with the utmost care to consider portability, user-friendliness and authenticity, and that is something you don't see every day. And I thought I had this because I love playing Game Boy games. I love experiencing them the way they are intended. But you can have that with retro modding. I thought I had it with the Analog Pocket, but I feel that the Chromatic might raise the bar for what the Game Boy is and can be capable of. So I cannot wait until I get my hands on the final release and see all the adjustments they've made and give it the full rundown, open it up, examining all the parts. But above all, I want to see that wave of reappreciating these older games and to experience them in the best way possible. I think the Chromatic will be able to do that, so we'll just have to wait and see when it releases later this year.
The battery terminal itself is what adds the additional...
Yeah, the squish in the buttons, yes. Yeah, that's phenomenal. Yeah, this is great. Awesome.
You want to know the worst part about setting this shot up? It's that I used all of my AA batteries that I ever have in this house, and I hope they don't run out while doing this shot. So if a Game Boy dies during halfway through of this, well, know what. Help. Send help. That's what I'm asking. Alright, let's do this.
This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.